My name is Margaret Delacroix, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought I understood the bond between a mother and her child. I believed that the home I'd lived in for 4 decades was mine, that the sacrifices I'd made over the years meant something, and that my son would never look me in the eye and demand I pay him rent to live under the roof I'd called home since before he was born. I was wrong about all of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's a warning, a lesson, and maybe, if you're going through something similar, it's the encouragement you need to stand up for yourself when everyone else expects you to just accept what's happening to you. Because that's what they expect from women like me. Women who've lived long enough to be dismissed, old enough to be overlooked, and kind enough to be taken advantage of. They expect us to be grateful for whatever scraps of respect we're thrown. They expect us to shrink ourselves smaller and smaller until we disappear entirely, apologizing for taking up space in our own lives. Well, I'm done shrinking. I'm done apologizing. And I'm definitely done letting anyone, not even my own flesh and blood, treat me like I'm nothing more than an inconvenience in my own home. The morning it all started, I was doing what I'd done every morning for the past 43 years. I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made countless breakfasts for my family, watching the sunrise paint golden streaks across the walls through windows I'd cleaned just the day before. The coffee was brewing in the same percolator my husband Thomas had bought me for our 20th wedding anniversary, and I was already mentally planning my day around the small routines that had given my life structure and meaning since he passed 5 years ago. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets when you live alone. Not empty quiet, but peaceful quiet. The kind of silence that feels full of memories and possibilities rather than loneliness. I'd grown to treasure these morning moments, these few precious hours before the rest of the world demanded my attention, when I could simply exist in the space Thomas and I had built together. I was buttering my toast, humming an old song we used to dance to in this very kitchen, when I heard the front door slam. Not close. Slam. The sound reverberated through the house like a gunshot, making me jump and nearly drop my knife. Heavy footsteps thundered across the hardwood floors of the entryway, followed by the distinctive sound of multiple suitcases being dragged across the floor. My heart started racing, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden disruption of my peaceful morning. I knew those footsteps. I'd been hearing them stomp through this house for over 4 decades, from the time they belonged to a little boy racing down the stairs for breakfast to the teenager who'd slam doors when he didn't get his way to the grown man who'd visit less and less frequently as the years went by. David was back. I set down my toast and walked toward the front of the house, my slippers making soft whisking sounds against the floor. The sight that greeted me in the entryway stopped me cold. My 45-year-old son stood surrounded by what looked like half a household's worth of belongings. Suitcases, boxes, garbage bags stuffed full of clothes, and even a few pieces of furniture I didn't recognize were scattered across the floor of my entryway, like the aftermath of some domestic explosion. "David?" I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "What's all this?" He looked up at me, and I was struck by how much he'd aged since I'd last seen him 3 months ago. His face was thinner, more angular, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. His dark hair, which had always been his pride, was now streaked heavily with gray and looked like he'd been running his hands through it. But it was his eyes that concerned me most. They had a hardness to them I'd never seen before, a coldness that made something in my chest clench with worry. "Ma," he said, not quite meeting my gaze. "I need to stay here for a while." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Not a request, not even really an announcement. A statement of fact, delivered in a tone that suggested my opinion on the matter was neither requested nor required. Of course, honey, I said immediately, because that's what mothers do. We open our doors and our hearts without question, especially when our children are clearly struggling. You know you're always welcome here. This is your home too. Something flickered across his face at those words, something I couldn't quite identify but that made my stomach twist uneasily. He started dragging his belongings further into the house without asking where he should put them, claiming space with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Where are Madison and Connor?" I asked, referring to his 15-year-old daughter and 13-year-old son. I hadn't seen my grandchildren since before the divorce proceedings had started getting ugly. "They'll be here later," he said, hefting a box that looked like it contained kitchen appliances. "Hope you don't mind, but they're going to need the guest bedroom. I'll take my old room upstairs." Again, not a request, not a discussion, a declaration. But I pushed down my discomfort because this was my son, and he was clearly going through a difficult time. Divorce is hard on everyone, especially the children, and if my grandchildren needed a stable place to stay while their parents figured things out, then of course I would provide that. "That's fine, sweetheart," I said, following him as he made his way toward the back of the house. "But David, what happened? Last we talked you said you and Patricia were working things out in counseling." He stopped so abruptly that I almost walked into him. When he turned to face me, that strange hardness in his eyes had intensified. "Patricia happened," he said, his voice bitter. "Apparently working things out meant she gets the house, half my retirement, and primary custody while I get to start over with nothing at 45. My heart broke for him. I reached out to touch his arm, the same way I'd comforted him when he was small and the world felt too big and scary to navigate alone. "Oh, David. I'm so sorry. But you're not starting over with nothing. You have your children, you have your career, and you have a mother who loves you. We'll figure this out. Together." For just a moment, his expression softened, and I saw a glimpse of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunder scared him during summer storms. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by that unfamiliar hardness. "Yeah, well, we'll see about that," he said, turning away from me and continuing his march through my house. Over the next few hours, I watched as my son systematically took over my home. He didn't ask before moving my reading chair out of the living room to make space for a massive recliner he'd brought with him. He didn't mention that he was planning to set up what appeared to be a complete home office in what had been Thomas's study. The room I'd kept exactly as my husband had left it as a way of keeping his memory close. When Madison and Connor arrived, that evening, delivered by Patricia in a car that barely stopped long enough for them to get their belongings out, I felt my heart lift for the first time all day. My grandchildren were beautiful, intelligent kids who'd always brought joy into my life. Madison had inherited David's dark hair, but Patricia's delicate features, while Connor was all arms and legs and seemed to grow taller every time I saw him. But something was different about them, too. They seemed subdued, almost wary, as they hugged me hello. Madison's smile didn't reach her eyes, and Connor kept glancing around the house like he was memorizing escape routes. "Grandma Maggie," Madison said softly, "Dad says we're going to be living here for a while." "That's right, sweetheart," I said, smoothing her hair back from her face. "You can stay as long as you need to. This is your home too." Again, that flicker of something across their faces that I couldn't quite interpret. But children are resilient, I told myself. They'd adjust. We all would. That first week passed in a blur of adjustment and accommodation. I found myself tiptoeing around my own house, trying not to disturb David as he transformed my peaceful home into his temporary headquarters. He was on the phone constantly, talking to lawyers, real estate agents, and financial advisors in a voice that carried through the thin walls of the house I'd never realized weren't soundproof. The children were polite but distant, spending most of their time in their room or outside. When I tried to engage them in conversation, They answered in monosyllables and kept glancing toward wherever their father was as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I told myself this was normal. Divorce is traumatic for everyone involved, and David was clearly under enormous stress. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The man I'd raised to be kind and considerate was still there somewhere underneath the worry and anger. He just needed time to find his footing again. But as the days turned into weeks, David's behavior became more concerning rather than less. He started treating my house like it was his personal hotel, leaving dishes in the sink for me to clean, dropping his clothes wherever he took them off, and expecting me to cook meals for everyone without so much as a thank you or an offer to help with the grocery bill. When I gently mentioned that perhaps we should talk about household responsibilities and expenses, he looked at me like I'd suggested something unreasonable. "Ma, I'm going through a divorce," he said, as if that explained everything. "I've got lawyers bleeding me dry and a job that barely covers child support. I can't exactly afford to be throwing money around right now." "I understand that, David," I said carefully. "But groceries for 4 people cost significantly more than groceries for 1, and the utilities are higher with everyone here. I'm not asking you to pay for everything, just to help out where you can." "Help out?" His voice had an edge to it that made me uncomfortable. "Ma, you're retired. You've got Dad's pension and Social Security. I'm the one who's struggling here." The implication hung in the air between us, that my financial security somehow meant I should subsidize his entire family's living expenses. That my fixed income, carefully budgeted to support 1 person, should stretch to cover 4 without any contribution from him. But I didn't push the issue because he was my son, and he was hurting, and mothers are supposed to sacrifice for their children no matter how old those children get. The first real warning sign came about 3 weeks after they'd moved in. I was sitting at my kitchen table, working on a crossword puzzle and enjoying my morning coffee, when David walked in looking like he'd been up all night. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was something manic about the way he was moving. "Ma, we need to talk," he said, sitting down across from me without invitation. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" He leaned forward, his elbows on my kitchen table, and looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "I've been thinking about our situation here," he said. "About what's fair and what makes sense going forward." "Okay," I said, slowly, not sure where this was heading but already feeling uneasy about the direction. "The thing is, Ma, I'm not just visiting here anymore. This is my home now, too. My kids' home. We're contributing to this household, we're part of the family dynamic, and I think it's time we started treating this living arrangement like the partnership it really is." Partnership. The word sat strangely in the space between us. I'd never thought of my son living in my house as a partnership. I'd thought of it as a mother helping her child during a difficult time. "What do you mean by partnership, David?" "I mean we're all adults here, and we should all be contributing equally to the household expenses. It's not fair for you to carry the entire financial burden just because this house is in your name." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "David, this house isn't just in my name. It's my house. Your father and I bought it before you were born. We paid the mortgage for 30 years. This is where I live." "I know that, Ma, but I live here too now. My kids live here. We're a family unit, and family units share expenses." There was something about the way he was talking, something rehearsed about his words, that made my skin crawl. Like he'd practiced this conversation in his head, or maybe even with someone else. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to hear the answer. "I'm suggesting that we split the household expenses 4 ways. You, me, Madison, and Connor. Everyone pays their fair share." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the refrigerator humming, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. You want me to pay rent to live in my own house? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It's not rent, Ma. It's your contribution to the household expenses. Just like mine would be my contribution. Fair and equal. Fair and equal. I repeated the words, tasting their bitterness. David, I'm 72 years old. I own this house outright. There is no mortgage, no rent, no housing payment of any kind. The only household expenses are utilities, maintenance, and property. Taxes. All of which I've been paying alone for the 5 years since your father died, and for 20 years before that when you were living here as my dependent child. Ma, you're not understanding what I'm trying to say. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, standing up from the table because I needed to move, needed to put some distance between myself and this conversation that felt like it was happening in some alternate reality. You're telling me that because you've decided to move back into my house with your children. I now owe you money to continue living here. It's not about owing me money. It's about everyone contributing fairly to the household we're all part of. The household that exists in my house, that I own, that I've maintained and paid for since before you were born. David's face was getting red, the way it used to when he was a teenager and wasn't getting his way. Ma, this attitude is exactly the problem. You're acting like you're doing us some huge favor by letting us stay here, like we should be grateful for every scrap of hospitality you throw our way. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. David, you are my son. You and Madison and Connor are always welcome in my home. But that doesn't mean I should have to pay you for the privilege of continuing to live in the house I've called home for over 4 decades. Nobody's asking you to pay me anything, he said, his voice rising. I'm asking you to contribute your fair share to our shared living expenses, just like I'm going to contribute mine. What shared living expenses? I asked, my own voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. The electric bill that's gone up because there are 4 people using electricity instead of 1? The grocery bill that's tripled because I'm feeding 4 people instead of 1? The water bill, the heating bill, all the bills that have increased because you decided to move your entire family into my house without discussing it with me first? So you do think you're doing us a favor, he said, and there was something triumphant in his voice, like he'd caught me in some kind of trap. You do think we should be grateful. I think you should be respectful, I said, my hands shaking as I gripped the back of my chair. I think you should remember that this is my home and I didn't ask for any of this. Your home, he repeated mockingly. Your home that you're going to live in alone forever because you're too selfish to share it with your own family. The word selfish hung in the air like a curse. Selfish. Me, who had raised him, supported him through college, helped him with his down payment when he bought his first house, babysat his children countless times so he and Patricia could have date nights or take vacations. Selfish, for expecting to continue living in my own house without paying rent to my own son. David, I said, my voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I need you to think very carefully about what you're saying to me right now. What I'm saying is that things are going to have to change around here, he said, standing up and towering over me in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. What I'm saying is that I'm not going to live as a charity case in anyone's house, even yours. What I'm saying is that if we're all going to live here together, we're going to do it as equals, with everyone contributing equally. And if I don't agree to pay rent in my own house? The question sat between us like a loaded weapon. David's face went through several expressions in quick succession, settling finally on something cold and determined. Then maybe you need to think about whether this living arrangement is really working for anyone, he said. The threat was unmistakable. Pay rent in my own house or find somewhere else to live. Give up the home I'd shared with my husband, where I'd raised my children, where every corner held memories of a lifetime spent building something beautiful and meaningful, or submit to the financial demands of my own son, I stared at him, this man I'd carried in my body for 9 months, whom I'd nursed and rocked and worried over for 45 years, whom I'd loved unconditionally even when he made choices I didn't understand or approve of. I looked into his eyes and tried to find some trace of the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and tell me I was the most beautiful mother in the world. He wasn't there. Or if he was buried so deep under resentment and entitlement that I couldn't reach him. "How much?" I asked finally, my voice barely audible. $800 a month, he said immediately, as if he'd already calculated. That covers your portion of utilities, groceries, household expenses, and maintenance. $800 a month. On my fixed income, that represented a significant portion of my monthly Social Security and pension payments. Money I'd been using for my own groceries, my medications, my car insurance, the small luxuries that made my retirement bearable. "David, that's more than I spend on everything combined living here alone." "Well, you're not living here alone anymore," he said matter-of-factly. "Costs go up when more people are involved. That's just basic economics." Basic economics, as if my home was some kind of business venture rather than the place where I'd built my life. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Fair enough," he replied, but there was no warmth in his agreement. "But Ma, I need an answer soon. We can't keep living in this limbo where nobody knows what's expected of them." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone, gripping the back of my chair so tightly my knuckles had turned white. I could hear him moving around in what used to be Thomas's study, probably getting back to whatever important business had kept him up all night planning this ambush. I sank back into my chair and stared at the crossword puzzle I'd been working on when this conversation started. 7 across. One who takes advantage. I'd been stuck on it earlier, but now the answer seemed painfully obvious. User. The rest of that day passed in a haze of disbelief and growing dread. I moved through my house, seeing it through new eyes. The living room where David had rearranged all the furniture to accommodate his recliner. The kitchen where he left his dishes for me to clean. The study where he'd set up his office without asking permission. When had I stopped being the homeowner and become the guest? When had my son started seeing my generosity as weakness and my love as something to be exploited? That evening, Madison knocked softly on my bedroom door. When I opened it, she was standing in the hallway looking small and worried. "Grandma Maggie, are you okay? Dad said you and he had a disagreement about money." I knelt down to her level, looking into her young face and seeing the anxiety there. "We had a conversation about how things are going to work with everyone living here," I said carefully. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about practical things." "Are you going to make us leave?" she asked, and the fear in her voice broke my heart. "Oh, sweetheart, no. You and Connor are always welcome here. This is your home too for as long as you need it to be." "But what about Dad?" What about Dad indeed? How do you explain to a 15-year-old girl that her father is trying to charge her grandmother rent to live in her own house? How do you help a child understand that sometimes the people we love most are capable of hurting us in ways we never imagined possible? "Your dad and I are still figuring things out," I said finally. "But no matter what happens between us, you and Connor will always have a place here with me." She hugged me then, fierce and tight, and I held her and wondered how I'd gotten to this place in my life. How I'd raised a son who could look me in the eye and demand I pay him to continue living in the home I'd worked 40 years to own outright. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my house settling around me. Every creak and whisper was familiar, as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. This house had seen me through pregnancy and childbirth, through the terrible twos and teenage rebellions, through the gradual decline and eventual loss of my husband. These walls had witnessed my joys and sorrows, my triumphs and failures, my growth from a young wife and mother into the woman I'd become. and now my son wanted me to pay him $800 a month for the privilege of continuing to call it home. I thought about my monthly budget, carefully calculated to stretch my fixed income to cover all my needs. $800 would mean no more small donations to the charities I supported, no more occasional dinners out with my friends from church, no more little gifts for Madison and Connor on holidays and birthdays, no cushion for unexpected expenses like car repairs or medical bills. It would mean living month to month, paycheck to paycheck, at 72 years old in the house I owned free and clear. But the alternative was what? Moving into some cramped apartment or assisted living facility, leaving behind the home where Thomas and I had built our life together, starting over at my age, learning to navigate a new neighborhood, new neighbors, new routines. Or maybe David was right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe fair really did mean everyone contributing equally, regardless of who owned what or who had sacrificed what to get to this point. Maybe my old-fashioned ideas about family and generosity were outdated in a world where adult children charge their elderly parents rent to live in their own homes. I must have finally fallen asleep sometime after midnight, my mind still churning, with questions and calculations, and the growing realization that my son was prepared to force me out of my own home if I didn't submit to his demands. When I woke up the next morning, there was an envelope slipped under my bedroom door. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope from my bedroom floor. My name was written across the front in David's familiar handwriting, but something about the formal lettering made my stomach clench with dread. I sat on the edge of my bed, the morning light filtering through the curtains I'd sewn myself 20 years ago, and stared at that envelope like it might bite me. When I finally worked up, the courage to open it, I found a single sheet of paper with what appeared to be an official notice typed in a business-like font. The header read, "Notice to pay rent or quit premises," and my heart nearly stopped beating. The document informed me that I had 30 days to begin paying monthly rent of $800 or vacate the property. It was signed by David and dated the previous day, which meant he'd been planning this formal notice even while we were having our kitchen conversation. While I'd been struggling with the emotional weight of his demands, he'd already moved on to legal-sounding threats. I read the notice 3 times before the words fully sank in. My own son had served me with an eviction notice, in my own house. The house where I'd changed his diapers, nursed him through childhood illnesses, and celebrated every milestone of his life. The paper fell from my hands and fluttered to the floor as I tried to process what was happening to my life. This couldn't be legal, could it? You can't evict someone from their own home. But the formal language and official appearance of the document made me doubt everything I thought I knew about my rights and my security. I got dressed slowly that morning, my movements feeling mechanical and strange. When I finally made my way to the kitchen, David was already there with Madison and Connor, the 3 of them eating breakfast at my table like nothing had changed. Like he hadn't just threatened to throw me out of my own home. "Morning, Ma," David said cheerfully, looking up from his eggs with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sleep well?" I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of remorse or uncertainty about what he'd done. There was nothing. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than he'd been in weeks, like delivering that ultimatum had lifted some weight off his shoulders. "David, we need to talk about this notice you left in my room." "Oh, that," he said, taking another bite of his breakfast. "I figured it would be easier if we had everything in writing. Keeps things clear and professional." Professional. As if the relationship between a mother and son should be governed by business practices and legal documents. "Kids," I said, looking at Madison and Connor, who were both staring down at their plates with the uncomfortable expressions children get when they sense adult conflict brewing. "Why don't you go get ready for school?" They practically fled from the kitchen, leaving David and me alone with the weight of what he'd done hanging between us. "You can't evict me from my own house, David." "I'm not evicting you, Ma. I'm establishing clear expectations for our shared living arrangement. You said you needed time to think, so I'm giving you 30 days to make your decision. My decision. About whether to pay you rent to live in the house I own. Your decision about whether you want to be part of this household as an equal contributor, or if you'd prefer to make other arrangements. The casual way he said other arrangements made my blood run cold. He was talking about me leaving my home, abandoning everything I'd built here, as if it were just another option on a menu of possibilities. David, I raised you better than this. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, something flickered across his face that might have been shame, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. You raised me to be independent and self-sufficient, he said. You raised me not to be a burden on anyone. Well, I'm not going to be a burden on you, and I'm not going to let you be a burden on us. How am I a burden? This is my house. Ma, you're 72 years old. You can't maintain this place on your own forever. The roof needs work, the heating system is ancient, and don't even get me started on the plumbing in the upstairs bathroom. Face it, you need help, and we're here to provide it. All I'm asking is that you contribute fairly to the arrangement. There it was again, that word, fairly. As if fairness meant ignoring who owned what and who had sacrificed what to get to this point. If the house needs work, I'll hire contractors, I said. I've been maintaining this property for 5 years, since your father died, and for 20 years before that when you were living here as our dependent. With what money, Ma? You're on a fixed income. Do you have any idea what a new roof costs? What about when the furnace dies, or when the foundation needs work? The questions hit like physical blows because he wasn't entirely wrong. I did worry about major repairs and how I'd afford them on my budget. But that worry had never translated into a willingness to hand over control of my home to someone else. I'll figure it out. I always have. Or, David said, leaning forward with the expression of someone presenting a reasonable solution, you could let me help. Let us be partners in maintaining this place. I've got contracting experience, I know people in the trades, and between my income and your pension, we could keep this house in perfect condition. Partners. There was that word again. But what he was describing didn't sound like partnership. It sounded like a takeover. What happens to my ownership of the house? In this partnership? What do you mean? I mean, if we're partners, if you're contributing to maintenance and improvements, what claim does that give you to the property itself? David's face darkened. Ma, I'm not trying to steal your house. I'm trying to help you keep it. By charging me rent to live in it. By having everyone contribute fairly to the costs of living here. We were going in circles, the same arguments dressed up in slightly different words. But underneath the circular logic, I was beginning to understand something that made my stomach turn. David wasn't just asking for rent money. He was trying to establish some kind of legal or financial claim to my property. The formal notice, the talk of partnership, the emphasis on shared expenses and equal contributions, it all pointed towards something more permanent than temporary help during his divorce. I need to think about this, I said finally. Take all the time you need, David replied. You've got 30 days. The next few weeks were the strangest and most uncomfortable of my entire life. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around David and walking on eggshells to avoid triggering another confrontation. He, meanwhile, acted like everything was perfectly normal, like serving your mother with an eviction notice was. Just standard family procedure. But normal was the last thing our situation had become. David started making changes to the house without asking permission or even giving me advance notice. He rearranged furniture in the living room to better accommodate his needs. He installed a lock on what used to be Thomas's study, claiming he needed privacy for his work calls. He even brought in a girlfriend I'd never met before, a woman named Jessica who seemed to appear out of nowhere and immediately started treating my house like her own personal project. Jessica was probably in her late 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of aggressive friendliness that felt more like a weapon than genuine warmth. The first time I met her, she was standing in my kitchen reorganizing my spice cabinet while David watched approvingly from the breakfast nook. "Oh, you must be David's mother," she said, when she noticed me standing in the doorway. "I'm Jessica. I hope you don't mind, but I noticed your spices weren't organized alphabetically. It's so much more efficient this way." I stared at her rearranging my spices, condiments I'd been using and organizing in my own way for over 4 decades, and felt something inside me snap. "Actually, I do mind," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "I'd prefer if you asked, before reorganizing my kitchen." Jessica's smile never wavered, but something cold flashed in her eyes. "Of course. I was just trying to help. David mentioned that you've been having trouble keeping up with household management lately." Trouble keeping up with household management. As if my perfectly clean and organized home was somehow evidence of my declining capabilities. "David said that?" "Well, not in so many words," Jessica said, glancing toward David for support. "But he's worried about you living alone in such a big house. We all are." We all are. This woman I'd never met before was now part of a collective we that was worried about my ability to manage my own life. "Jessica's right, Ma," David said, finally speaking up from his position at the table. "This house is a lot for one person to handle. Maybe it's time to think about whether it makes sense for you to stay here long term." There it was again, the suggestion that I should consider leaving my own home because it was too much for me to handle. Except now the suggestion was coming not just from my son, but from his girlfriend who had appointed herself an expert on my living situation after knowing me for approximately 5 minutes. "This house has been my home for over 40 years, I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I think I'm capable of determining whether or not I can manage it." "Of course you are," Jessica said in that patronizing tone people use when they're humoring someone they consider delusional. "But wouldn't it be nice to not have to worry about all the maintenance and upkeep? There are some lovely senior communities in the area where you could have your own apartment without any of the responsibilities of home ownership." Senior communities. She was suggesting I move into assisted living like I was some confused old woman who couldn't be trusted to live independently. "I'm not ready for assisted living," I said firmly. "Oh, these aren't assisted living facilities," Jessica continued, apparently oblivious to my growing anger. "They're active adult communities. Lots of activities, social opportunities, people, your own age to spend time with. It might be exactly what you need." What I needed, according to this stranger, was to be shuffled off to some age-segregated housing development so David and Jessica could have my house to themselves. "What I need," I said, my voice tight with controlled fury, "is for people to stop reorganizing my kitchen and making decisions about my life without consulting me." I walked out of the room before I said something I'd regret, but I could hear Jessica whispering to David behind me, probably discussing my unreasonable attitude and how difficult I was being about perfectly reasonable suggestions. That evening, I found Madison sitting alone on the front porch, staring out at the street with the kind of expression that looked far too old for her 15-year-old face. "Mind if I join you?" I asked. She scooted over to make room for me. On the porch swing Thomas had hung for me on our 25th wedding anniversary. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood settle into evening routines. "Grandma Maggie," Madison said finally, "are you really going to make us leave?" The question caught me off guard. "Sweetheart, I would never make you leave. This is your home too, for as long as you need it to be." "But Dad says you don't want us here anymore. He says you're being selfish about money and making things difficult for everyone." My heart broke a little more. David was using his own children as weapons in whatever game he was playing, making them feel unwanted and insecure to put pressure on me. "Madison, I want you and Connor here. I love having you here. The problems your father and I are having don't have anything to do with you kids." Then why can't you just pay the rent he's asking for? $800 isn't that much money, is it? $800 isn't that much money. A 15-year-old's perspective on finances, probably influenced by whatever David had told her about my supposed wealth and selfishness. Sweetheart, it's not about the money. It's about the principle. This is my house. I own it. Your grandfather, and I worked for 30 years to pay off the mortgage so we could live here without owing anyone anything. When someone owns their home, they don't pay rent to live in it. But if Dad is helping with expenses and maintenance, shouldn't he get something in return? I could hear David's arguments coming out of her mouth, probably word for word the way he'd presented them to her. Your father is welcome to contribute to household expenses, I said carefully. But that's different from me paying him rent to live in my own house. I don't understand the difference. How do you explain property rights and financial independence to a teenager whose father has been filling her head with his version of fairness and family obligation? Let me ask you something, I said. If you owned a car and your friend needed to borrow it for a few weeks, would it be fair for your friend to charge you money to drive your own car? Madison thought about this for a moment. No, that would be weird. That's what your father is asking me to do. He's asking me to pay him to live in my own house. But he says it's about everyone contributing equally. Equal contribution would be everyone paying their share of the actual expenses, groceries, utilities, things like that. What your father is proposing is that I pay him a monthly fee that's more than all my actual expenses combined. I could see Madison struggling with this concept, trying to reconcile what I was telling her with whatever David had said. Maybe you could just talk to him again, she said finally. Maybe there's some compromise you could work out. Compromise, as if there was some middle ground between paying rent in my own house and not paying rent in my own house. Maybe, I said, not wanting to burden her with the full extent of how unreasonable her father was being. But as the days passed, it became clear that David had no interest in compromise. If anything, he seemed to be escalating his campaign to make me so uncomfortable in my own home that I'd either submit to his demands or leave voluntarily. Jessica started showing up more frequently, always with some new project or improvement she wanted to make to my house. She rearranged my living room furniture because the current layout wasn't optimized for conversation. She brought new curtains for the dining room because mine were outdated and depressing. She even suggested we knock down the wall between the kitchen and dining room to create better flow and more natural light. Every suggestion was presented as helpful, as if she was doing me some enormous favor by wanting to renovate my home, according to her personal preferences. And David supported every single one of her ideas, nodding along enthusiastically as she described how much better my house would be with her improvements. Ma? You should really consider Jessica's suggestions, he said one evening after she'd spent an hour explaining why I needed to replace all my kitchen cabinets. She has a real eye for design, and some updates would really increase the value of this place. Increase the value of this place. As if my home was some kind of investment property rather than the place where I'd lived my entire adult life. I like my kitchen the way it is, I said. I like my house the way it is. But, Ma, some of this stuff is really outdated. When's the last time you updated anything? The 80s? I updated things when they needed updating. The dishwasher is only 3 years old. I had the bathroom renovated 5 years ago when your father got sick and needed grab bars installed. Grab bars, Jessica said with a little laugh. See, that's exactly what I mean. This house feels like a nursing home instead of a family home. A few updates would make it feel so much more welcoming and modern. A nursing home. She was comparing my home to a nursing home because I'd installed safety features to help my dying husband navigate the bathroom. Those grab bars helped your grandfather maintain his dignity and independence during his illness, I said, my voice shaking with anger. I'm not removing them so you can have a more aesthetically pleasing bathroom. Of course not, Jessica said quickly. I wasn't suggesting we remove them. I was just saying that with a few design updates, we could make the whole space feel less institutional. But I could see it in her eyes. She absolutely wanted those grab bars gone, along with everything else in my house that reflected the reality of my age and my life experiences. She wanted to erase me from my own home and redecorate it to suit her vision of what a family home should look like. "Jessica," I said, standing up from the table where we'd been having this conversation. "I appreciate your interest in helping, but I'm not planning to make any major changes to my house right now." "But Mrs. Delacroix," she said, and something about the way she used my formal name felt mocking. "You can't let a beautiful home like this stagnate. Houses need updating and refreshing, or they lose their value and become burdens instead of assets." Burdens instead of assets. My home, the place where I'd raised my family and built my life, was a burden that needed to be transformed into an asset through her improvements. "This house isn't a burden to me," I said firmly. "It's my home." "Well, of course it's your home," David said, jumping into the conversation with that reasonable tone he'd been using to disguise increasingly unreasonable demands. "But Ma, you have to think about the future. What happens if you get sick? What happens if you can't maintain this place anymore? Wouldn't it be better to make some improvements now while you can still enjoy them?" The implication was clear. I was going to get sick. I was going to become unable to maintain my home. It was inevitable, according to David. And the smart thing to do was start preparing for my decline by letting him and Jessica take over the management of my property. "I'm not sick," I said. "I'm perfectly capable of maintaining my home." "For now," Jessica said with that sympathetic smile people use when they're delivering bad news. "They think you're too naive to understand." "But David's right about planning for the future. Wouldn't it be nice to know that if something happened to you, the house would be in good hands?" Good hands, her hands presumably, the hands of a woman who thought my home looked like a nursing home and wanted to gut my kitchen to create better flow. That night, I lay in bed listening to David and Jessica talking in the living room below my bedroom. I couldn't make out all the words, but I could hear the tone of their conversation, the conspiratorial whispers that suggested they were making plans I wasn't included in. The next morning, I woke up to find they'd rearranged my living room again. Not just rearranged it, but completely transformed it. My comfortable reading chair, the one where I'd spent countless evenings reading and watching television, had been moved to a corner where it didn't face the TV properly. The coffee table Thomas and I had bought for our first apartment together had been replaced with some modern glass thing I'd never seen before. Even my family photos had been relocated, scattered around the room in what Jessica probably thought was a more artistic arrangement. "What happened to my living room?" I asked when I found David in the kitchen. "Jessica thought it would be nice to surprise you with a little refresh," he said without looking up from his newspaper. "Doesn't it look great? So much more open and modern." I didn't ask for a refresh. I liked my living room the way it was. "Ma, you never ask for anything. That's part of the problem. You're so stuck in the past that you can't see when things need to change. Stuck in the past. Because I liked my furniture arranged in a way that was comfortable and functional for me." "Where's my coffee table? The wooden one with the drawer?" Jessica thought the glass one was more in keeping with the updated look. "Your old one is in the basement if you really want it back." My old one, the coffee table Thomas and I had chosen. Together 47 years ago, was now my old one, banished to the basement so Jessica could replace it with something more in keeping with her vision for my home. "I want it back," I said. "Ma, just give the new arrangement a chance. You might find you like it better than the old way." "I don't want to give it a chance. I want my living room back the way it was." David finally looked up from his paper, and there was irritation in his expression. "Fine, I'll move your precious coffee table back if it's that important to you. But Ma, you can't expect everything to stay exactly the same forever. Change isn't always bad." Change isn't always bad. But this wasn't change, it was invasion. This was someone else taking control of my space and making decisions about how I should live in my own home. That afternoon, while David was at work and Jessica was presumably wherever she went when she wasn't rearranging my house, I walked through each room and tried to catalog all the changes that had been made without my permission. It was more extensive than I'd realized. In the kitchen, not only had my spices been reorganized, but several of my small appliances had been moved or put away entirely. My old hand mixer, which worked perfectly fine, had been replaced with some fancy new model. My dish towels, embroidered with flowers that I'd always found cheerful, had been replaced with plain white ones that Jessica probably thought were more sophisticated. In the dining room, my china cabinet had been rearranged so that my everyday dishes were hidden in the back, and some expensive-looking serving pieces I'd never seen before were displayed prominently in front. My grandmother's wedding china, which I'd treasured for decades, had been moved to a less visible shelf to make room for Jessica's additions. Even the bathroom had been altered. My toiletries had been organized according to some system I didn't understand, and several bottles of expensive lotions and perfumes that didn't belong to me had appeared on the counter. A new shower curtain, modern and geometric where mine had been floral and cheerful, hung in place of the one I'd chosen. It was like living in a museum exhibit titled, "How Jessica Thinks Old Ladies Should Live." Every personal touch, every item that reflected my preferences and history, was being systematically erased and replaced with someone else's vision of appropriate decor for a woman my age. But the worst part wasn't the physical changes to my house. It was the way David and Jessica talked to me about these changes, as if I should be grateful for their improvements, as if my preferences didn't matter, because I was too old and set in my ways to know what was good for me. "You'll love it once you get used to it," Jessica would say whenever I expressed displeasure with one of her modifications. "Change is hard at first, but then you wonder how you ever lived the old way." The old way, the way I'd been living successfully and contentedly for over 4 decades, was now the old way, something to be improved upon and ultimately discarded. I started spending more time in my bedroom, the one room in the house that remained relatively unchanged. I'd sit by the window and look out at the garden Thomas and I had planted together, wondering how my life had gotten so completely out of my control. The 30-day deadline David had given me was approaching fast, and I still didn't know what I was going to do. $800 a month was a significant portion of my fixed income, but the alternative, according to David, was finding somewhere else to live. Somewhere else to live. At 72 years old, I was supposed to start over somewhere else because my own son had decided I didn't deserve to live in my own house without paying him for the privilege. I thought about calling my sister in Florida, or my friend Helen, from church, but I couldn't bring myself to explain the situation to anyone. How do you tell people that your own child is essentially extorting you? How do you admit that the son you raised and loved and sacrificed for is treating you like a tenant in your own home? The shame of it was almost as overwhelming as the anger. I'd failed somewhere along the way. I'd raised a son who could look at his elderly mother and see dollar signs instead of the woman who'd given him life and love and everything she had to give. 3 days before the deadline, Jessica presented me with a brochure for something called Sunset Manor, an active adult community about 20 minutes away from my house. I took the liberty of getting some information about places you might like, she said, settling the glossy brochure on my kitchen table like she was doing me a favor. "This one looks really nice. They have activities and social opportunities, and the apartments are designed specifically for seniors." I stared at the brochure, with its photos of smiling elderly people playing cards and participating in what looked like organized fun. The tagline read, "Where life begins at 55. You want me to move into a retirement community. I want you to have options," Jessica said. "David and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider. What would make you happiest in the long run? David and I have been talking about my future, about what would make me happiest, without including me in the conversation. What would make me happiest is continuing to live in my own home. But is that realistic long term? Jessica asked, in that patient tone people use when they're explaining obvious things to slow children. This house is so big, and there's so much maintenance. Wouldn't it be nice to let someone else worry about all of that while you focus on enjoying your retirement? I do enjoy my retirement. I enjoy it in my house, surrounded by my things, in the neighborhood where I've lived for over 40 years. But think about all the new friends you could make, all the activities you could participate in. There's a whole world of possibilities out there if you're open to them. New friends, activities, possibilities. All available to me if I was willing to give up my home and move into an age-segregated community where my biggest decision would be whether to play bingo or attend the craft hour. I don't want new friends, I said. I have friends. I have a life. I have a home. Mrs. Delacroix, Jessica said, and again that formal address felt like mockery. I understand that change is scary, but sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for our own good. For my own good, moving out of my home and into a retirement community was for my own good, according to a woman who'd known me for less than a month. Has David seen this brochure? Of course. We picked it out together. He's really excited about the possibility of you finding somewhere that would make you truly happy. Excited about the possibility of me moving out so they could have my house to themselves, more likely. That evening, I confronted David about the brochure. Jessica showed me information about Sunset Manor today. Oh, good, he said, not even trying to pretend he wasn't involved. What did you think? Looks like a nice place, right? David, I don't want to move into a retirement community. Ma, just look at the options with an open mind. You might find something you really like. I like my house. I know you do. But wouldn't it be nice not to have to worry about maintenance and repairs? Not to have to deal with a big empty house all by yourself. Big empty house. My home, filled with 40 years of memories and love, was a big empty house that I shouldn't have to deal with. It's not empty when you and the kids are here. But we won't always be here, Ma. Eventually, my divorce will be finalized and we'll need to find our own place. What then? You'll be all alone in this big house again. There it was, the admission I'd been dreading. This wasn't about fairness or equal contribution or helping me with household expenses. This was about David needing a temporary place to stay during his divorce, and rather than being grateful for my help, he was trying to charge me for it while simultaneously pushing me toward giving up my home entirely. So you're planning to leave once your divorce is final? Well, yeah, we can't all live here forever. But you want me to pay rent while you're here and then move out myself once you leave? David had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Ma, that's not how I'd put it. How would you put it? I'd say we're trying to find solutions that work for everyone in both the short term and the long term. Solutions that work for everyone, meaning solutions that work for David and Jessica, regardless of what they mean for me. The solution that works for me is staying in my own home without paying rent to anyone. Ma, we've been through this. That's not a sustainable solution for anyone. It's been sustainable for me for 5 years since your father died. 5 years isn't that long. What about the next 10 years? The next 20? Are you really going to try to maintain this place all by yourself until you're 90? Maybe I would. Maybe I'd live in my house until I was 90 or 100, or until I died peacefully in the bedroom I'd shared with Thomas for so many years. Was that such an unreasonable thing to want? That's my decision to make, I said. Is it, though? David asked, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. Ma, what happens if you get sick? What happens if you fall and can't get up? What happens if you develop dementia and can't make good decisions anymore? Who's going to take care of you then? The questions felt like threats. Like he was telling me that my independence was temporary and conditional, subject to his approval and oversight. I'll cross those bridges when I come to them. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people in trouble, David said. You can't just wait until crisis hits to make plans. You have to think ahead. I am thinking ahead. I'm thinking I want to live in my own home for as long as I'm able to do so safely and independently. And who decides when you're no longer able to do that safely and independently? The question hung in the air like a sword over my head. Who decides? Not me, apparently. Someone else would decide when I was no longer competent to live in my own home. And based on this conversation, that someone would probably be my son. 2 days before David's deadline, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of agonizing over whether to pay the rent he was demanding or start looking for apartments, I decided to educate myself about my rights. I'd never been the kind of person who consulted lawyers or got involved in legal disputes. Thomas and I had lived quiet, peaceful lives, resolving our problems through conversation and compromise. But nothing about my current situation felt like something that could be resolved through normal family communication. I called the legal aid office and explained my situation to a kind woman who listened without judgment as I described my son's demands and threats. "Ma'am," she said when I finished, "I think you need to come in and speak with one of our attorneys. What you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse." Financial elder abuse? I'd never heard the term before, but something about it made my heart race. Is that a real thing? Unfortunately, yes. It's more common than most people realize, and it often involves family members who take advantage of elderly relatives' generosity or confusion about their rights. But I'm not confused about my rights. I know I own my house. That's good. But do you have documentation to prove your ownership? Documentation. I thought about the filing cabinet in Thomas's study, the one I'd been avoiding since his death, because going through his papers felt too painful. I think so. My husband handled all the paperwork, but everything should be in his files. I'd strongly recommend you gather those documents and bring them with you when you come in. Proof of ownership, insurance papers, tax records, anything that establishes your legal right to the property. You really think this is serious enough to involve a lawyer? Ma'am, if your son is threatening to evict you from your own home, unless you pay him rent, then yes, I think it's serious enough to involve a lawyer. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone and trying to process what the legal aid woman had told me. Financial elder abuse. My son was potentially committing a crime against me. That evening, after David left to have dinner, with Jessica and the kids were in their room doing homework, I finally worked up the courage to go into Thomas's study. The room had been mostly taken over by David's work setup, but Thomas's old filing cabinet was still there in the corner, covered with dust and some of David's paperwork. I moved David's files aside and opened the top drawer of the cabinet I hadn't touched in 5 years. Inside were neat folders labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting: property taxes, insurance, utilities. And there, in the back, a thick folder labeled house deed and mortgage papers. My hands were shaking as I pulled out that folder and opened it for the first time since Thomas's death. Inside were documents going back to 1981, when we'd first bought the house. The original mortgage paperwork, with both our names on it. Insurance, policies, property tax assessments, and there, near the bottom of the pile, the deed to the property. I spread the deed out on Thomas's desk and read through it carefully. The house was owned jointly by Thomas Delacroix and Margaret Delacroix, his wife. When Thomas died, I'd assumed his half of the ownership had automatically passed to me, but I'd never actually checked to make sure the paperwork was in order. Looking at these documents now, I realized I had no idea what my legal status was regarding the house. Did I own it outright, or was it still technically part of Thomas's estate? Had David somehow acquired a legal claim to the property that I didn't know about? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Questions that should have been answered 5 years ago when Thomas died, but that I'd been too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to address properly. Tomorrow was David's deadline. Tomorrow I was supposed to either agree to pay him $800 a month in rent or face eviction from my own home. But tonight, sitting in my late husband's study surrounded by 40 years of carefully maintained paperwork, I realized I might not know as much about my own legal situation as I thought I did. And if I didn't know exactly where I stood legally, then maybe David didn't either. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope. I spent most of that night going through every document in Thomas's filing cabinet, spreading papers across his desk like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. Each folder revealed another layer of our carefully organized life together, 43 years of marriage documented in insurance policies, tax returns, and maintenance. Records that showed just how meticulously my husband had cared for our home and our future. By 3 a.m, I had a clear picture of our financial history, and what I discovered both relieved and confused me. Thomas had been even more thorough than I'd remembered. Every major household expense was documented, every improvement, and repair carefully recorded with receipts and warranties. The house had been completely paid off in 2003, 7 years before his death. We'd owned it free and clear for over 20 years. But mixed in with all the familiar paperwork were documents I didn't remember seeing before. Legal papers with official seals and notarized signatures that looked important, but used language I couldn't entirely understand. Something about a trust, references to beneficiaries, and most puzzling of all, what appeared to be a transfer of deed document dated just 6 months before Thomas's death. I stared at that transfer document for a long time, trying to make sense of the legal terminology. It seemed to suggest that ownership of the house had been moved into some kind of trust arrangement, but the beneficiary information was unclear, and there were multiple signatures I didn't recognize. Had Thomas changed something about our ownership structure during his final illness? And if so, why hadn't he discussed it with me? We'd always made major financial decisions together, even during the difficult months when his cancer treatments were consuming so much of our energy and attention. A cold fear started growing in my stomach as I realized how little I actually knew about the legal status of the house I'd been calling mine for the past 5 years. What if David knew something I didn't? What if there was some legal basis for his claims that I wasn't aware of? I gathered all the documents into a neat pile and put them in a folder to take with me to the legal aid office. Whatever these papers meant, I needed someone who understood property law to explain them to me before David's deadline arrived in a few hours. The sunrise found me still sitting at Thomas's desk, exhausted but strangely determined. For weeks, I'd felt powerless and confused, allowing David to dictate the terms of my living situation without really understanding what rights I had. But now, surrounded by evidence of the life Thomas and I had built together, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. I felt like fighting back. David was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at my table with his laptop and a cup of coffee, looking remarkably relaxed for someone who had given his mother an ultimatum that was set to expire in a matter of hours. "Morning, Ma," he said without looking up from his screen. "Sleep well?" "I spent the night going through your father's papers," I said, setting my folder of documents on the counter where he could see it. For the first time in weeks, I saw genuine surprise cross his face. Dad's papers? Why? Because I realized I don't know as much about the legal status of this house as I should. I found some documents I'd never seen before, and I think I need to have a lawyer look at them. Something shifted in David's expression, a tightening around his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "Ma, what kind of documents?" "Trust papers. Transfer deeds. Things your father apparently set up before he died that he never explained to me." David closed his laptop and gave me his full attention for the first time in weeks. "Ma, you don't need to involve lawyers in family business. If you have questions about Dad's papers, I can help you figure them out." "How would you know anything? About your father's legal arrangements?" "Because he talked to me about them before he died. He was worried about making sure everything was set up to protect you if anything happened to him." This was news to me. Thomas had talked to David about legal arrangements he'd never discussed with his own wife. The idea seemed both unlike my husband and deeply troubling. What did he tell you exactly? David stood up and moved closer to me, his expression serious but also somehow gentle, like he was about to deliver difficult news he'd been protecting me from. Ma, Dad was concerned about what would happen to you if you couldn't take care of this place anymore. He wanted to make sure there were provisions in place so you'd never have to worry about losing your home or being unable to afford its upkeep. What kind of provisions? Legal arrangements that would allow someone in the family to step in and help manage things if you ever became unable to do it yourself. He didn't want you to end up in a situation where the house became too much for you to handle alone. The word sent a chill down my spine. Someone in the family to step in and help manage things. Someone like David, presumably. Are you telling me your father signed over some kind of control of this house to you? Not control, Ma. Management authority. There's a difference. The house is still yours, but if you ever become incapacitated or unable to make good decisions about the property, there are legal mechanisms in place to protect both you and the house. Incapacitated or unable to make good decisions. The very phrases David had been using to question my independence and competence for weeks. And who decides whether I'm incapacitated or unable to make good decisions? David's expression became even more serious. That's usually determined by medical professionals, Ma. Doctors, psychiatrists, people who are qualified to assess cognitive function and decision-making capacity. But someone has to initiate that process. Someone has to request those evaluations. Well, yes, usually a family member who's concerned about the person's welfare. There it was, the trap I was beginning to see more clearly with each revelation. Thomas, in his desire to protect me, had apparently created legal mechanisms that could be used to declare me incompetent and strip away my control over my own home. And David, as my nearest relative, would be the one with the authority to set those mechanisms in motion. David, are you threatening to have me declared incompetent? Ma, of course not. I'm just trying to help you understand the legal protections Dad put in place. But you have to admit, some of your recent decisions haven't been entirely rational. What decisions? Like refusing reasonable requests for shared household expenses. Like rejecting perfectly good suggestions for home improvements. Like being hostile to Jessica when she's only trying to help make things more comfortable for everyone. Refusing to pay rent in my own house was irrational. Objecting to having my home redecorated without my permission was hostile. According to David, my desire to maintain control over my own living situation was evidence of impaired judgment. I want to see these trust documents, I said. Ma, they're complicated legal papers. They're not going to make much sense to you without proper explanation. Then I'll get proper explanation from a lawyer. David's face darkened. Ma, involving lawyers in family matters is expensive and unnecessary. If you have questions, I can walk you through everything Dad set up. I can explain exactly how the protections work and what they mean for you. I'd prefer to hear it from someone who doesn't have a financial interest in the outcome. Financial interest? David's voice rose with what sounded like genuine indignation. Ma, everything Dad set up was designed to protect you. I don't have any financial interest in any of this. You're asking me to pay you $800 a month to live in my own house. That sounds like a financial interest to me. That's completely separate from the legal arrangements Dad made. That's about fair contribution to current household expenses. And if I refuse to pay your rent demands, what happens then? Do I suddenly become incapacitated and unable to make good decisions about my property? David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his response carefully. Ma, that's not how it works. The legal protections are there for genuine emergencies, not for family disagreements about money. But you're the one who would decide what constitutes a genuine emergency. I'm not the only one involved in making those kinds of decisions. There are other safeguards built into the system. Other safeguards. Other people involved in decisions about my competence and my property. People I didn't know who had been given authority over my life without my knowledge or consent. I want copies of all the documents your father signed, I said, and I want them today. Ma, I don't have copies here. They're with Dad's lawyer. Then call the lawyer and get them. It's not that simple. There are privacy laws and estate procedures that have to be followed. Privacy laws that prevented me from accessing legal documents about my own property. Estate procedures that kept me in the dark about arrangements that affected my future. The more I learned about what Thomas had done, the more trapped I felt. But I also felt something else, something that had been growing stronger since I'd started going through those files. I felt angry. Not just at David for his demands and manipulations, but at Thomas for making legal arrangements that affected my life without including me in the decisions. David, I'm going to see a lawyer today. Ma, please don't do anything hasty. Let me make some calls and see if I can get you the information you need without involving outside attorneys. You have until this afternoon to provide me with copies of every document your father signed that affects this property. If you can't do that, I'm taking what I found in his files to a lawyer and letting them sort it out. Something flickered across David's face that I couldn't quite identify. Fear, anger, calculation, whatever it was, it convinced me that I was finally on the right track. Fine, he said after a long pause. I'll see what I can do. That morning, I called the legal aid office and made an appointment for later in the day. The woman I spoke to remembered our previous conversation and seemed pleased that I was taking action to protect myself. Bring everything you have, she advised. Property deeds, trust documents, anything that relates to ownership or management of your home. And Mrs. Delacroix, don't let anyone pressure you into signing anything or agreeing to anything before you understand exactly what it means. I spent the rest of the morning making copies of all the documents I'd found, using the little printer in Thomas's study, while David was out of the house. I wanted to make sure I had my own set of everything, just in case the originals mysteriously disappeared. As I worked, I found myself thinking about my husband in ways I hadn't for years. Thomas had been a good man, a loving husband and a devoted father. But he'd also been someone who liked to handle problems privately, who preferred to manage difficulties without involving others in the details. Had he thought he was protecting me by making legal arrangements I didn't know about? Or had he simply not trusted me to understand and participate in important decisions about our shared life? The Thomas I remembered would never have intentionally created a situation where I could lose control of my home. But the Thomas I remembered also would never have made major legal decisions without discussing them with me, which meant either my memory of my husband was incomplete, or there was something about these documents I didn't understand yet. Around noon, Jessica arrived with several large shopping bags and what appeared to be fabric samples. "Oh, good, you're here," she said when she saw me in the kitchen. "I wanted to show you some ideas I have for updating the window treatments. The current curtains are so dated, and with a few simple changes, we could really brighten up the whole house." I stared at her, this woman who had appointed herself the decorator of my home, and felt something inside me snap. "Jessica, I need you to stop." "Stop what?" "Stop redecorating my house. Stop reorganizing my belongings. Stop making decisions about my home without asking me." Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Mrs. Delacroix, I'm only trying to help. David mentioned that you've been feeling overwhelmed by household management, and I thought some simple improvements might make things easier for you." "David mentioned that I've been feeling overwhelmed?" "Well, not in so many words, but it's obvious that maintaining a house this size is a lot of work for someone your age. I just thought that if we updated a few things, made the space more functional and cheerful, it might be less stressful for you, less stressful for me, by having my personal belongings rearranged and replaced with items chosen by someone else. Jessica, I appreciate your desire to help, but I don't want my house updated or improved. I like it the way it is." "But Mrs. Delacroix, You can't seriously want to live surrounded by things from the 1980s forever. A little modernization would make such a difference in how this place feels. This place feels like home to me. I don't want it to feel like anything else. Jessica set down her shopping bags and gave me the kind of patient look people use when they're dealing with someone they consider unreasonable. I understand that change is difficult, especially at your age. But sometimes we have to be open to new possibilities, even when they feel uncomfortable at first. At my age, because being 72 meant I was incapable of making good decisions about my own preferences and living space. Jessica, I want you to return everything you've changed to the way it was before. My spice cabinet, my dish towels, my furniture arrangement, all of it. But it looks so much better now, more organized, more modern. Once you get used to it, I'm sure you'll prefer the new arrangements. I don't want to get used to it. I want my house back the way it was. Jessica's expression hardened slightly. Mrs. Delacroix, I think you're being unnecessarily resistant to positive changes. David and I are only trying to help you create a more comfortable living environment. David and I. You and my son have decided what kind of living environment. I should have, without consulting me about my own preferences. We've consulted you. We've made suggestions and offered improvements, but you've rejected every single idea without even considering the benefits. Because I don't want benefits that require giving up my autonomy in my own home. Autonomy? Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mrs. Delacroix, no one is threatening your autonomy. We're offering to help you maintain and improve a property that's becoming too much for you to handle alone. There it was again. The assumption that my house was too much for me to handle. The presumption that I needed their help whether I wanted it or not. Jessica, I need you to leave. Excuse me? I need you to take your shopping bags and your fabric samples and your improvement plans and leave my house. Mrs. Delacroix, I think you're being unreasonable. David isn't going to be happy about this. David doesn't get to decide who's welcome in my home. Doesn't he, though? Jessica asked, and something in her tone made my blood run cold. I mean, if this is his home too now, doesn't he have a say in who visits and what changes get made? His home too. According to Jessica, David had equal say in decisions about my property because he was living here temporarily during his divorce. This is my house, I said firmly. For now, Jessica replied, and the words hit me like a physical blow. For now. As if my ownership of my own home was temporary and conditional, subject to change based on decisions made by other people. After Jessica left, I sat in my living room surrounded by her improvements and felt more alone than I had since Thomas died. Everything familiar had been subtly altered, transformed into someone else's vision of how I should live. Even my own home no longer felt entirely mine. When David returned that afternoon, he found me sitting in what used to be my reading corner, staring at the glass coffee table that had replaced the wooden one Thomas and I had chosen together 47 years ago. Ma, Jessica called. She said you were upset about some decorating ideas. I asked her to stop rearranging my house without my permission, and she told you she was only trying to help. She told me this was your home too now and that you should have a say in who visits and what changes get made. David sat down across from me, his expression serious. Ma, we need to talk about boundaries and expectations. If we're all going to live here together, there have to be some shared decisions about how the household operates. This isn't your household, David. This is my house where you're staying temporarily during your divorce. Is it, though? I mean, if I'm contributing financially to the maintenance and upkeep, if my children are living here, if I'm investing time and energy into improving the property, at what point does it become a shared household rather than just your house where we're visiting? The question was carefully phrased, but the implication was clear. David was establishing a claim to my property based on his temporary residence and unwelcome contributions. Are you telling me you think you have ownership rights to my house? I'm telling you that property rights aren't always as simple as whose name is on the deed. When people invest time and money into a property, when they contribute to its upkeep and improvement, they can develop equity and rights that go beyond technical ownership. Equity and rights based on unwanted improvements and demanded contributions. David was suggesting that by forcing his way into my home and making changes I hadn't requested, he was earning some kind of legal claim to my property. David, I want to see those trust documents now. Ma, I told you I'd have to get them from Dad's lawyer. Then call the lawyer now, or give me his name and number so I can call him myself. David hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw something that made my heart race. He didn't want me talking to Thomas's lawyer. He didn't want me getting independent information about whatever legal arrangements had been made. Actually, Ma, there might be a problem with that. What kind of problem? Dad's lawyer retired a couple of years ago. The firm he worked for was dissolved, and I'm not sure what happened to all the client files. The legal documents that supposedly gave David authority over my property were conveniently inaccessible because the lawyer who created them had retired and his files had disappeared. How very convenient for David's claims and threats. Then how do you know what's in the trust documents? Because Dad explained everything to me before he died. He walked me through all the provisions and made sure I understood my responsibilities. Responsibilities that apparently included charging me rent to live in my own house and allowing his girlfriend to redecorate my home without my consent. David, I'm going to ask you directly, and I want a straight answer. Do you have any legal claim to this house? Ma, property law is complicated. There are different kinds of ownership and different kinds of legal authority. What matters is that Dad made arrangements to protect you and the house. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you without getting into legal technicalities that would just confuse you. Legal technicalities that would confuse me, because I was too old and simple to understand the arrangements that affected my own property and future. David, tomorrow I'm going to see a lawyer. I'm going to take every document I found in your father's files, and I'm going to get independent legal advice about my rights and your claims. Ma, that's your choice, but I want you to understand that involving lawyers in family matters can have consequences you might not anticipate. What kind of consequences? Legal proceedings can be expensive. They can take a long time to resolve. And sometimes the outcomes aren't what people expect when they start down that path. Was he threatening me, warning me that legal action could backfire somehow? Or simply reminding me that lawyers cost money I might not be able to afford on my fixed income? Are you trying to scare me away from getting legal advice? I'm trying to protect you from making decisions you might regret. Family matters should be resolved within the family whenever possible. This stopped being a family matter when you served me with an eviction notice. That wasn't an eviction. Notice, Ma, it was a request for fair contribution to household expenses. Written in legal language and presented as an ultimatum. Because clear communication sometimes requires formal documentation. Clear communication, formal documentation. David was speaking like a bureaucrat rather than a son, using language designed to obscure rather than clarify the reality of what he was doing to me. David, your deadline is today. You wanted an answer about whether I'd pay rent to live in my own house. Here's my answer. Absolutely not. Something flickered across his face, an expression I couldn't quite read, but that made me feel suddenly vulnerable. Ma, I hope you'll reconsider. I really do, because the alternative isn't going to be pleasant for anyone. What alternative? The alternative where we have to explore other options for resolving this situation. Other options. Legal mechanisms that could declare me incompetent. Medical evaluations of my decision-making capacity. The trust provisions that Thomas had supposedly established to protect me, but that could apparently be used to control me. Are you threatening to have me declared incompetent? Ma, I would never do that unless it was absolutely necessary for your own protection. unless it was absolutely necessary, meaning if I continued to refuse his demands and resist his authority, he would take steps to have me legally declared unable to manage my own affairs. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with rage and fear. "Ma, I live here too now. You can't just throw me out because you don't like the conversation we're having. This is my house. I can absolutely throw you out. Actually, you can't, not without following proper legal procedures for removing tenants who have established residency. Tenants who have established residency. According to David, he was no longer a guest in my home, but a tenant with legal rights that prevented me from asking him to leave. You're not a tenant. You don't pay rent. I pay my share of household expenses. I contribute to the maintenance and upkeep of the property. I've established residency by living here continuously for over a month. Legal tenancy doesn't require a formal lease agreement. He'd planned this. Every step of this nightmare had been carefully calculated to establish his presence in my home as a legal right, rather than a temporary accommodation. He'd moved in not as my son seeking help during a difficult time, but as someone establishing a claim to my property. I want you out of my house by the end of the week. Ma, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now too, whether you like it or not. The sooner you accept that reality, the easier this is going to be for everyone. His home now too. My house had become his home through force and manipulation, and he expected me to accept that reality and submit to his authority. We'll see. About that, I said, standing up and walking toward the stairs. Where are you going? To get ready for my appointment with a lawyer. Ma, you're making a mistake. You're escalating a family disagreement into a legal battle that's going to hurt everyone involved. You escalated this into a legal battle when you served me with a formal notice demanding rent. I'm just evening the playing field. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and closed the door behind me, my heart pounding with adrenaline and determination. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was taking action instead of simply reacting to David's demands and threats. Whatever legal arrangements Thomas had made, whatever authority David thought he had over my property, I was going to find out the truth. And if my son thought he could manipulate and intimidate me into surrendering my home, he was about to discover exactly how wrong he was. I had raised him to be strong and independent. Now he was going to find out that his mother possessed those same qualities, and that I was prepared to fight for what was rightfully mine. The legal aid office was located in a modest building downtown that I'd driven past countless times without ever imagining I'd need their services. As I sat in the waiting room clutching my folder of documents, I felt like I was betraying some fundamental principle about how families should resolve their problems. Good people didn't sue their own children. Loving mothers didn't involve lawyers in disputes with their sons. But then I remembered David's cold smile when he'd told me this was his home now too, and Jessica's casual dismissal of my right to control my own living space, and I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Mrs. Delacroix? A young woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor emerged from one of the offices. I'm Sarah Chen, one of the attorneys here. Thank you for coming in. She led me into a small but comfortable office lined with law books and files. As I settled into the chair across from her desk, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that someone was finally going to listen to my story without dismissing my concerns. Apprehension about what I might learn about my own situation. Why don't you start by telling me what's been happening? Sarah said, pulling out a legal pad and pen. I began with David's arrival and his demands for rent, but as I talked, the story expanded to include Jessica's takeover of my home, David's threats about incompetency evaluations, and the mysterious trust documents I'd discovered in Thomas's files. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly just giving me her complete attention in a way that felt both professional and deeply compassionate. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment before speaking. Mrs. Delacroix, I want you to know that what you're describing is indeed a form of elder abuse. It's more common than most people realize, and unfortunately, it often involves family members who exploit their elderly relatives' trust and affection. But David keeps insisting he's trying to help me. He says everything he's doing is for my own protection. That's a very common justification, Sarah said gently. Abusers often convince themselves and their victims that their controlling behavior is motivated by love and concern. But protection that requires you to give up your autonomy and financial security isn't really protection at all. What about the trust documents he mentioned? Could my husband have really signed away my rights to control my own property? Let's look at what you brought with you, Sarah said, opening the folder I'd placed on her desk. She began examining the documents methodically, starting with the property deed and working through the various papers chronologically. I watched her face as she read, trying to gauge her reactions and understand what she was discovering. Mrs. Delacroix, she said, after several minutes, these are very interesting documents. Some of them are exactly what I'd expect to see. Your original deed, mortgage papers, property tax records, but these other papers. She held up the documents I'd been most confused about. These are concerning. Concerning how? Well, first of all, some of these signatures don't look authentic to me. I'm not a handwriting expert, but your husband's signature appears to be inconsistent across different documents. My heart started racing. What does that mean? It could mean that some of these documents were forged. The trust papers in particular have several red flags. The language is unusual, the notarization looks questionable, and most importantly, there's no record of them being filed with the county clerk's office. Should they have been filed? Any legitimate trust or property transfer would absolutely have been recorded with the county. These documents appear to be, well, I hate to say it, but they appear to be fabricated. The room seemed to spin around me as the implications of what she was saying sank in. Are you telling me that David has been lying about having legal authority over my property? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Based on what I see here, you are the sole owner of your home, with no restrictions on your authority to control it. These trust documents your son referenced appear to be forgeries, designed to make you believe you have less power than you actually do. I felt like I might faint. Weeks of anxiety and fear, sleepless nights wondering if I was losing my home, hours of self-doubt about my own competence and rights, all based on documents that weren't even real. But how would David get fake documents? Who would create something like that? Unfortunately, it's not as difficult as you might think. There are unscrupulous people who will create official-looking paperwork for a fee. And with desktop publishing software, someone with basic computer skills could create convincing forgeries. So David has been manipulating me with fake legal documents. It appears that way, yes. But Mrs. Delacroix, we need to verify this through proper channels. I'm going to recommend that we request official records from the county clerk's office and have a handwriting expert examine these questionable documents. How long will that take? A few days for the county records, possibly a week or two for handwriting analysis. But in the meantime, I can tell you with confidence that you have every right to demand that your son cease his threats and his demands for rent payment. What if he refuses to stop? What if he carries through on his threats to have me declared incompetent? Sarah's expression grew serious. Mrs. Delacroix, those threats are actually illegal. What's called undue influence and financial exploitation of an elderly person are criminal offenses in this state. If your son continues making those threats, we can seek a restraining order and potentially file criminal charges. Criminal charges against my own son. The thought made me feel sick, but also strangely empowered. For weeks, I'd felt like a victim with no recourse. Now, I was learning that I had legal protections and that David's behavior was not just morally wrong, but actually criminal. What should I do now? First, I want you to go home and secure all these original documents. Put them somewhere your son can't access them, preferably in a safe deposit box or with a trusted friend. Second, I want you to start documenting everything David says and does regarding your property and your living situation. Dates, times, witnesses if possible. And then? Then we're going to send your son a formal letter explaining that his threats and demands constitute elder abuse, that his claimed authority over your property is based on fraudulent documents, and that any further attempts to coerce or intimidate you will result in legal action. Will that stop him? It might. Many people engaged in this kind of behavior back down quickly when they realize their victim has legal representation and knows their rights. But Mrs. Delacroix, you need to be prepared for the possibility that this could escalate before it gets better. Escalate how? Your son has invested a lot of time and energy into establishing control over your home and your finances. People don't usually give up that kind of power without a fight. He might become more aggressive, more desperate, or more manipulative before he accepts that his scheme isn't going to work. The warning chilled me, but it also strengthened my resolve. David had been counting on my ignorance and my reluctance to fight back. He'd assumed that his threats would be enough to make me submit to his demands. Now he was going to discover that his mother was neither as naive nor as powerless as he'd believed. I want you to send that letter, I said firmly. Are you sure? Once we take this step, there's no going back to trying to resolve things quietly within the family. Sarah, this stopped being a family matter the moment my son decided to commit fraud and elder abuse. I want him to know that I know what he's doing, and I want him to stop. She nodded approvingly. I'll draft the letter today and have it delivered tomorrow. In the meantime, please be careful. Don't confront your son directly about what we've discovered. Don't let him know you've been to see a lawyer. Just act normally while we gather more evidence and prepare our case. What if he asks about my appointment today? Tell him you were visiting a friend or running errands. The less he knows about your legal consultation, the better. I left the legal aid office feeling simultaneously vindicated and terrified. Vindicated because my instincts about David's behavior had been correct. Terrified because I was now engaged in what amounted to a legal war with my own son. The drive home gave me time to process what I'd learned. David had deliberately deceived me with forged documents. He'd used my grief and confusion about Thomas's death to manipulate me into believing I had no rights in my own home. He'd planned this entire scenario, probably from the moment he decided to move back in. But why? What did he hope to gain by forcing me out of my house or establishing control over my property? The most obvious answer was that he wanted the house for himself and Jessica. A beautiful 4-bedroom home in a desirable neighborhood, owned free, and clear, would be quite a prize for a man going through an expensive divorce. But there might be more to it than simple greed. David's divorce was apparently costing him significant money in legal fees and settlement payments. If he could gain control over my property, he might be able to use it as collateral for loans or even sell it outright to fund his legal battles with Patricia. The thought of my son selling the home Thomas and I had built together, the place where I'd planned to live out my remaining years, filled me with a rage so pure and cold it surprised me. I'd been willing to tolerate a lot of bad behavior because David was my child and I loved him, but I would not allow him to steal my home. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Jessica's car parked on the street. Of course she was there, probably continuing her renovation plans while I was out. The sight of her vehicle in front of my house felt like an invasion, a reminder that my private space had been completely compromised. I entered through the front door and immediately heard voices coming from the kitchen. David and Jessica were seated at my table, with what appeared to be architectural drawings spread out between them. "Ma, there you are," David said as I appeared in the doorway. "How was your afternoon?" "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the anger burning in my chest. "What are you two working on?" "Just some ideas for home improvements." Jessica said with that bright smile I'd learned to distrust. Nothing major, just some ways to better utilize the space and increase the property value? Property value, as if my home was nothing more than a real estate investment to be optimized for maximum return. What kind of improvements? David and Jessica exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. Well, David said carefully, we were thinking about converting the basement into a separate apartment. You know, something with its own entrance and kitchenette. It would be perfect for, well, for someone who wanted privacy and independence, but still wanted to be close to family. A basement apartment. They were planning to move me into my own basement while they took over the main house. That sounds expensive, I said, working hard to keep my voice level. It would be an investment, Jessica said enthusiastically. The rental income from a basement apartment would more than cover the renovation costs over time. Plus, it would give you your own private space, where you wouldn't have to worry about household management or maintenance. My own private space, in the basement of my own house. How generous of them to offer me the basement while they enjoyed the rest of the home I'd worked 40 years to own. I'm not interested in moving to the basement, I said. Ma, you haven't even looked at the plans, David said, unrolling one of the drawings. Look how nice this could be. Your own living room, bedroom, bathroom, even a little kitchen area. You'd have complete independence and privacy. Complete independence and privacy in the basement, while they had complete control of everything else. I said I'm not interested. But Ma, think about how much easier this would make things for everyone. You wouldn't have to worry about stairs anymore, or about household maintenance, or about sharing common spaces. It would be like having your own apartment without any of the hassles of moving or finding a new place. Without any of the hassles of maintaining my rights to my own property, he meant. David, I'm not moving to the basement of my own house so you and Jessica can take over the rest of it. That's not what this is about, Jessica said, her smile becoming strained. This is about creating a living arrangement that works for everyone long-term. You'd have your space, we'd have ours, and everyone could be comfortable and independent. I'm already comfortable and independent in my own house. Are you, though? David asked, and something in his tone made me go cold. Ma, you've been struggling with basic household decisions. You've been resistant to helpful suggestions. You've been hostile to people who are trying to support you. Those aren't signs of independence. Those are signs of someone who's having trouble adapting to changing circumstances. Signs of someone who's having trouble adapting. According to David, my refusal to surrender control of my home was evidence of cognitive decline rather than reasonable self-defense. I'm adapting just fine to my circumstances. What I'm not adapting to is having my property stolen out from under me. Stolen? David's voice rose with apparent indignation. Ma, nobody's stealing anything from you. We're trying to help you. Make smart decisions about your future. By moving me into the basement and taking over my house. By creating a sustainable living arrangement that protects your interests and ours. My interests are in remaining in control of my own home. Ma, you can't control everything forever. At some point, you're going to need help managing this place. Wouldn't it be better to plan for that reality now, while you still have input into the arrangements? While I still had input. As if my input was a temporary privilege that would be withdrawn once David decided I was no longer competent to have opinions about my own life. I'll manage my property as long as I'm able to do so. When and if I need help, I'll ask for it. But will you? Jessica asked, and her tone had shifted from friendly to challenging. Because so far, you've rejected every offer of help and every suggestion for improvement. How are we supposed to believe you'll make good decisions about accepting assistance when you can't even accept minor changes to improve your living situation? Because I'd rejected their unwanted interference in my home, I was supposedly incapable of making rational decisions about accepting help when I actually needed it. The help you're offering comes with strings attached that I'm not willing to accept. What strings? David asked. Control over my property, authority over my living arrangements, the right to make decisions about my home without consulting me. Ma, that's not what we're asking for. Isn't it? You want me to pay you rent. You want me to accept Jessica's decorating changes without complaint. You want me to move to the basement so you can have the rest of the house. And when I resist any of these demands, you suggest that my resistance is evidence of declining competence. David and Jessica looked at each other again, and I could see them silently communicating about how to respond to my newfound clarity about their intentions. Mrs. Delacroix, Jessica said finally, I think you're misunderstanding our motivations. David and I care about you, and we're concerned about your welfare. Sometimes people who care about us have to make difficult suggestions, even when we don't want to hear them. And sometimes people who claim to care about us are actually trying to exploit us. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which they were. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I was directly challenging their stated motivations and calling their behavior what it really was. Ma, David said, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's a horrible thing to say. After everything I've done for you, after all the help I've offered, you're accusing me of exploitation? I'm stating a fact. You moved into my house uninvited, demanded I pay you rent to live in my own home, allowed your girlfriend to redecorate my personal space without permission, and threatened to have me declared incompetent if I didn't submit to your demands. If that's not exploitation, what would you call it? I would call it a son trying to help his mother navigate a difficult situation while also managing his own family crisis. By taking over my home and charging me for the privilege of continuing to live in it. By creating a sustainable arrangement that addresses everyone's needs. My need is to maintain control over my own property. Your arrangement doesn't address that need at all. David stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Ma, you're being completely unreasonable. We've offered you fair solutions and you've rejected every single one. At some point, we have to start questioning whether you're capable of making rational decisions about this situation. There it was. The threat I'd been waiting for. Because I refused to accept his demands, David was questioning my mental competence. Are you threatening to have me declared incompetent? I'm saying that someone who consistently makes bad decisions might not be the best judge of what's in their own interest. And who would be a better judge? You? Someone who's thinking clearly about long-term consequences instead of just reacting emotionally to reasonable suggestions. Someone who's thinking clearly. According to David, I was reacting emotionally while he was thinking clearly. My desire to maintain control of my own home was emotional. His desire to take control of my home was rational. David, I want you and Jessica to leave my house. Ma, we've been through this. We live here now too. You can't just throw us out because you don't like the conversations we're having. This is my house. I can absolutely ask unwanted guests to leave. We're not guests, Ma. We're family members who've established residency here. There are legal procedures that have to be followed before we can be forced to relocate. Legal procedures. David was hiding behind tenant rights laws to justify his continued occupation of my home. Fine, I said, surprising myself with my own calm. Then I'll follow whatever legal procedures are necessary to have you removed. Ma, that could take months, maybe longer, and it would be expensive. Are you really prepared for a long legal battle with your own son? Are you really prepared to steal your own mother's home? Nobody's stealing anything. We're trying to work out a fair arrangement for everyone. Your fair arrangement involves me paying you rent and moving to the basement of my own house. Our fair arrangement involves everyone contributing appropriately to a shared living situation and everyone having adequate space and privacy. Shared living situation. My house had become a shared living situation in which I was expected to contribute financially while having no authority over decisions. "I'm done with this conversation," I said, turning toward the stairs. "Ma, where are you going?" "To my room, which is still my room, in my house, until you figure out how to steal that from me, too." I climbed the stairs with as much dignity as I could muster, my heart pounding with adrenaline and determination. Behind me, I could hear David and Jessica whispering urgently, probably planning their next move in the campaign to take over my property. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know that their forged trust documents had been exposed as fraudulent. They didn't know that I had legal representation and that their threats constituted criminal elder abuse. They thought they were dealing with a confused and isolated elderly woman who could be manipulated into surrendering her rights. Tomorrow, they would discover exactly how wrong they were. That evening, I called my friend Helen from church and asked if I could store some important documents in her safe deposit box. "Of course, dear," she said without asking for details. "Is everything all right?" "It will be," I said. And for the first time in weeks, I actually believed it. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to the bank before David was awake. I placed all the original documents from Thomas's files in Helen's safe deposit box, keeping only copies for myself. If David tried to steal or destroy the evidence of his fraud, he would find that I'd already protected it. When I returned home, there was a certified letter waiting for me. My heart sank as I saw David's name in the return address, but when I opened it, I found something I hadn't expected. It was a formal eviction notice, typed on legal letterhead and citing various housing codes and tenant regulations. According to the document, I had 30 days to vacate the premises due to breach of occupancy agreement and failure to maintain safe and habitable living conditions. David was trying to evict me from my own house using fake legal documents that portrayed me as a tenant who had violated the terms of some imaginary lease agreement. I stared at the fraudulent eviction notice and felt something inside me crystallize into pure, cold determination. My son had moved beyond manipulation and intimidation into outright legal fraud. He was now creating false documents in an attempt to steal my home through pseudo-legal procedures. But I was no longer the confused and frightened woman he thought he was exploiting. I was a homeowner with legal representation who understood her rights and had evidence of his crimes. I picked up the phone and called Sarah Chen. "Sarah, it's Margaret Delacroix. My son just served me with a fake eviction notice. I think it's time to send that letter." Sarah Chen arrived at my house within 2 hours of my phone call, accompanied by a process server and armed with legal documents that would change everything. I watched from my front window as they approached the door, feeling a mixture of anticipation and sadness that it had come to this. When I opened the door to let them in, I saw David emerging from the kitchen with a coffee cup in his hand, looking relaxed and confident, right up until he noticed the official-looking strangers in my entryway. "David Delacroix?" the process server asked in a crisp, professional tone. "Yes," David replied, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to wariness. "You're being served with a cease and desist order and a notice of potential criminal charges related to elder abuse and fraud." The color drained from David's face as he accepted the documents. Behind him, Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway, her mouth falling open as she took in the scene. "Ma, what is this?" David asked, his voice tight with shock and growing anger. "This is me protecting myself from your illegal behavior," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor commanding immediate respect. "Mr. Delacroix, I'm Sarah Chen, your mother's attorney. The documents you've just been served outline numerous violations of elder abuse statutes, including financial exploitation, fraudulent documentation, and undue influence. You have 24 hours to cease all threats, demands, and attempts to control your mother's property." "Elder abuse?" David sputtered. "That's ridiculous. I'm trying to help my mother by creating forged trust documents and fraudulent eviction notices? Sarah asked calmly. By demanding rent payments for a property you have no legal claim to? By threatening to have her declared incompetent when she refuses your demands? I watched my son's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as he realized his carefully constructed scheme was collapsing around him. Those documents aren't forged, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Delacroix, we've had the signatures analyzed by a handwriting expert and verified the records with the county clerk's office. None of the trust documents you've referenced exist in any official capacity, and the signatures purporting to be your father's are clear forgeries. This is insane, Jessica interjected, stepping into the conversation with her hands on her hips. David's been trying to help his mother manage a property that's too much for her to handle alone. He's been contributing to household expenses and maintenance. There's nothing illegal about family members sharing living costs. There's nothing illegal about voluntary cost sharing, Sarah agreed. But there's very much illegal about threatening eviction, creating fraudulent legal documents, and using those documents to coerce an elderly person into surrendering control of their property. I never threatened eviction, David protested. Weakly. I walked to the hall table where I'd left the fake eviction notice he'd served me that morning. What would you call this then? I asked, holding up the document for Sarah to see. Sarah examined the notice quickly, her expression growing even more serious. Mr. Delacroix, this appears to be an attempt to use fraudulent legal documentation to force your mother from her home. This escalates your situation from misdemeanor elder abuse to potential felony fraud. Now wait just a minute, David said, his voice rising with panic. You can't prove I created that document. Actually, we can, Sarah replied calmly. The letterhead belongs to a law firm that's been closed for 3 years. The case numbers are fabricated, and most importantly, there's no legal basis for evicting a homeowner from their own property. This document is fraudulent on its face. I watched my son realize that his careful plans were not just falling apart, but actively putting him in legal jeopardy. The confidence and entitlement that had carried him through weeks of manipulation and threats were evaporating as he faced the reality of potential criminal charges. Ma, he said, turning to me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child, caught in serious misbehavior. Can't we talk about this privately? This is family business. We don't need lawyers and legal threats to work things out. We stopped being able to work things out as family when you decided to commit fraud against me, I said firmly. You forged legal documents, David. You threatened to have me declared incompetent. You tried to evict me from my own home with fake paperwork. These aren't family disagreements. These are crimes. I was trying to protect you, he said desperately. The house is too much for you to manage alone. You need help, and you're too stubborn to accept it voluntarily. Protection that requires fraud and coercion isn't protection, Sarah said. It's exploitation. What do you want from us? Jessica asked, her voice sharp with anger and fear. We've been living here for over a month. We've established residency. You can't just throw us out on the street. Actually, we can, Sarah replied. Residency rights don't apply when the initial occupancy was based on fraud and deception. Mr. Delacroix and his family have been living here under false pretenses, using threats and forged documents to establish their presence. They have no legal right to remain in this property. So what happens now? David asked, looking between Sarah and me with growing desperation. Now you have a choice, I said, feeling stronger and more certain than I had in months. You can gather your belongings and leave my house voluntarily within 24 hours, or we can pursue criminal charges and have you removed by law enforcement. Ma, please, David said. And for a moment I heard echoes of the little boy who used to come to me when he was hurt or scared. Where are we supposed to go? Madison and Connor need stability right now. They're already dealing with the divorce. And now you want to make them homeless too? The mention of my grandchildren hit me like a physical blow. Throughout this entire nightmare, they had been innocent victims of their father's schemes and my resistance to them. But I couldn't let my love for Madison and Connor trap me into accepting David's continued abuse. You should have thought about your children's stability before you decided to try to steal their grandmother's house, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. You should have considered their welfare before you forged legal documents and threatened their grandmother with eviction. I never meant for it to go this far, David said, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. I just needed a place to stay during the divorce, and when you started making things difficult about expenses, I thought maybe if you understood the legal realities. What legal realities? The fake trust documents you created? I thought if you believed Dad had made arrangements for me to help manage the property, you'd be more willing to accept reasonable contributions to household costs. So you decided to lie to me about what my own husband had done? You decided to manipulate my grief and confusion about Thomas's death to make me believe I had no rights in my own home? I didn't think you'd react so strongly. I thought you'd see the sense in sharing expenses and responsibilities. And when I didn't see the sense in it, you escalated to threats and fake eviction notices? David looked down at his feet, the weight of his actions finally seeming to register fully. I was desperate. The divorce is costing me everything. And I needed. You needed to steal from your own mother? I needed help, and you were being unreasonable about providing it. Asking you to respect my property rights isn't unreasonable, David. Expecting to live in my own home without paying rent to my own son isn't unreasonable. Mr. Delacroix, Sarah interjected, I need to make something very clear to you. The charges we could file against you are serious. Elder abuse, fraud, forgery, attempted theft by deception. You're looking at potential jail time and significant financial penalties. Your best option right now is to cooperate fully with the cease and desist order and remove yourself from your mother's property immediately. And if I don't? Then we file criminal complaints this afternoon, and you'll be dealing with law enforcement rather than civil attorneys. I watched my son weigh his options, seeing the calculations running behind his eyes. He was realizing that his gamble had failed catastrophically, that instead of gaining control over my property, he'd put himself in serious legal jeopardy. How long do we have to pack? Jessica asked, her voice subdued for the first time since I'd met her. 24 hours, Sarah said firmly. And during that time, there are to be no attempts to damage, remove, or alter anything belonging to Mrs. Delacroix. No retaliation, no further threats, no attempts to manipulate or pressure her in any way. What about Madison and Connor? I asked, my heart breaking at the thought of my grandchildren being displaced because of their father's crimes. That's not your responsibility, Ma, David said bitterly. You've made your position clear. Family means nothing to you compared to your precious property rights. The accusations stung because part of me worried it might be true. Was I prioritizing my home over my relationships with my grandchildren? Was I being vindictive toward David instead of trying to find a solution that would help everyone? David, I said carefully, Madison and Connor are always welcome in my home, but they're welcome as my beloved grandchildren, not as tools you can use to manipulate me into accepting your abuse. So they can visit, but we can't live here? You lost the right to live here when you decided to try to steal my house with forged documents. I wasn't trying to steal your house. I was trying to create a sustainable living arrangement that would work for everyone. By lying, manipulating, and threatening me. By trying to make you see reason when you were being impossibly stubborn about accepting help. We were going in circles again, the same justifications and denials that had characterized our arguments. For weeks. But this time, I had legal support and documented evidence of his crimes. This time, I wasn't standing alone against his manipulation. Mr. Delacroix, Sarah said. "This conversation isn't productive. You have your notice, you understand the terms, and you have 24 hours to comply. I strongly recommend you use that time to pack and arrange alternative housing rather than continuing to argue about decisions that have already been made." David looked at me one more time, his expression a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that might have been genuine regret. "Ma, I hope you're happy with your choice. I hope living alone in this big house is worth destroying your relationship with your son and grandchildren. I hope you understand that your relationship with me was destroyed the moment you decided to commit fraud against me," I replied. "I love you, David, but I won't be stolen from, even by my own child." He turned and walked toward the stairs, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jessica followed him, shooting me a look of pure venom before disappearing upstairs to begin packing. After Sarah and the process server left, I found myself alone in my house for the first time in over a month. The silence felt different than it had before David's arrival. Not peaceful exactly, but purposeful. I walked through each room, noting all the changes Jessica had made, all the ways my home had been altered to suit someone else's vision of how I should live. Over the next 24 hours, I watched my son pack up the life he'd tried to build in my home. Madison and Connor were confused and upset, asking questions David couldn't answer honestly about why they had to leave so suddenly. I spent time with them, explaining as gently as I could that sometimes adults make choices that have consequences, and that they would always have a place in my heart and my home, even if their father had to live somewhere else for a while. "Are you mad at Dad?" Madison asked as we sat on the front porch swing. "I'm disappointed in the choices he made," I said carefully. "But I love him, and I love you, and nothing about the situation changes that." "He says you're being mean to him because he asked you to help pay for groceries." I closed my eyes, feeling the pain of David's continued manipulation even as he was being forced to leave. He was still lying to his children, still portraying himself as a victim of my unreasonable behavior. "Sweetheart, the problems your father and I are having go beyond groceries. Grown-ups sometimes disagree about important things, and sometimes those disagreements can't be fixed with conversation alone." "But you could fix it if you wanted to, right? You could let us stay if you really wanted us here?" The question broke my heart because it revealed how David had framed the situation for his children. I was the one choosing to break up the family. I was the one who could fix everything if I just wanted to badly enough. "Madison, I want you here more than anything. But I can't let anyone, not even someone I love very much, treat me badly or take away my rights. Sometimes protecting yourself means making choices that hurt in the short term, but that keep you safe in the long term." I wasn't sure she understood, but she nodded and leaned against me, and I held her close and wondered how long it would be before I saw her again. When David loaded the last box into his car the next evening, he came to find me in the kitchen, where I was sitting with a cup of tea, trying to process everything that had happened. "Ma, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far." "I believe that," I said, and I did. "But David, intentions don't excuse actions. You forged legal documents. You threatened me with incompetency proceedings. You tried to evict me from my own home. Whatever your intentions were, what you actually did was commit crimes against your own mother." "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. I appreciate your apology, but David, I need you to understand that sorry isn't enough to fix what's been broken here. Trust, once lost, has to be rebuilt slowly and carefully. And it can only be rebuilt through honest actions, not just words." "What would it take for you to trust me again?" I thought about his question carefully. "It would take time. It would take you acknowledging fully what you did wrong, not just the parts that got you in legal trouble. It would take you demonstrating, through your actions, that you respect my autonomy and my property rights." And it would take you never, ever trying to manipulate or threaten me again. And if I did all that, if I proved that I could change, then maybe someday we could rebuild our relationship. But David, that would be your choice to make and your work to do. I can't want your redemption more than you do. He nodded slowly, tears running down his cheeks. I love you, Ma. Despite everything, I want you to know that I love you. I love you too, I said, and meant it despite everything. But love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect. After David and his family left, I spent the evening walking through my house and slowly beginning to restore it to the way it had been before their arrival. I moved my furniture back to its original positions, returned my belongings to their proper places, and took down the curtains and decorations Jessica had installed without my permission. With each change I made, I felt more like myself again. This was my home, the place Thomas and I had built together, the place where I intended to live out my remaining years on my own terms. I had fought for it and won, and no one would ever be able to take it from me again. The next morning, Sarah called to check on me and inform me that David had complied fully with the cease and desist order. There had been no attempts at retaliation or further manipulation. The legal crisis was over. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Sad," I said honestly, but also proud, and relieved, and grateful. Grateful for what? Grateful that I found the Gakiuri courage to fight back. Grateful that there are people like you who help people like me when their own families fail them. Grateful that I get to keep my home and my independence. Mrs. Delacroix, you should be proud of yourself. What you did took tremendous courage. Many people in your situation never find the strength to stand up for themselves. I almost didn't, I admitted. If David hadn't overplayed his hand with those fake documents, I might have just given in to his demands to keep the peace. But you didn't give in. When you understood what was really happening, you took action to protect yourself. That's exactly what you should have done. After I hung up, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in my reading chair, looking out at the garden Thomas and I had planted together so many years ago. The flowers were blooming beautifully, testament to the care and attention we'd put into making this place a true home. I thought about the lessons this experience had taught me. That love without respect is meaningless. That family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior. That protecting yourself isn't selfish, even when the people you're protecting yourself from are people you love. I thought about Madison and Connor and hoped that someday they would understand why their grandmother had to make such a difficult choice. I hoped that David would use this experience to become a better man and a better father. And I hoped that if they ever needed a safe place to land, they would know they could always come home to me. My house was quiet again, filled with memories and possibilities rather than conflict and manipulation. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was independent, and I was safe, and I was home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.